The fog that crept through Holmby Hills on the night of December 14th, 1966, moved slowly, as if uncertain of its destination. It curled around the stone pillars of estates, worth more than some small towns, past hedgerows trimmed with surgical precision, past gates that had witnessed decades of arrivals and departures. At 355 Carrollwood Drive, the house sat in darkness, though not the comfortable darkness of sleep. This was a different kind of quiet. The residence that had once hummed with the restless energy of its owner now held its breath, waiting for news that would never be good. Inside St. Joseph Medical Center in Burbank, less than 20 miles away, Walt Disney lay in a private room on the top floor. The man who had built kingdoms from ink and imagination, who had transformed orange groves into monuments of controlled happiness, was connected to machines that measured what remained of his life in beeps and lines. He had entered the hospital 10 days earlier, ostensibly for treatment of an old polo injury to his neck. That was the story anyway. The press had accepted it without question. They had no reason to doubt it. Walt Disney did not get sick. Walt Disney created. Walt Disney dreamed. Walt Disney did not die. But the tumor discovered in his left lung during surgery the previous month had told a different story. The malignancy had spread. There would be no miracle, no last-minute rescue of the kind his animators had perfected over 4 decades of storytelling. In the dim light of that hospital room, surrounded by a small circle of family members who had been sworn to secrecy, the most famous dreamer in American history was running out of time. The Carrollwood house waited. It had been designed for a man who never truly rested, a sprawling residence that balanced the appearance of domestic tranquility with the reality of constant motion. There was the backyard railroad, a 1/8 scale steam locomotive that circled the property on nearly half a mile of track, a private indulgence that predated Disneyland itself. There was the workshop, where he had spent countless hours tinkering, escaping the pressures of a media empire that had grown beyond what any single imagination could control. And there was Lillian, his wife of more than 4 decades, who had watched her husband withdraw into himself over the past several years, who had seen the coughing fits he dismissed as nothing, who had noticed how the cigarettes never left his hand, even as his body began its quiet rebellion. The official timeline of what happened next would be rendered in clean, respectful paragraphs. On the morning of December 15th at 9:35, Walter Elias Disney passed away from acute circulatory collapse, the result of lung cancer that had metastasized beyond intervention. He was 65 years old. The announcement reached the press within hours, though the cancer diagnosis was mentioned only in passing, almost parenthetically. The emphasis fell on his achievements, his vision, the legacy of joy he had created, the suffering, the fear, the months of concealment. These belonged to a different narrative, one that would not be told for years. At Carrollwood Drive, the news arrived by telephone. The precise moment, the exact words spoken. These details have faded into the private grief of those who were present. What remained was the house itself, suddenly transformed from a home into a monument. The railroad would continue to circle the property in the years that followed, maintained but rarely used. The workshop would preserve his tools exactly as he had left them, as if he might return at any moment to resume some half-finished project. The grounds would be tended with the same meticulous care that had always characterized the estate, even as the man who had demanded such precision was lowered into a grave at Forest Lawn Memorial Park, in a ceremony so private that many refused to believe it had happened at all. The rumors began almost immediately. He had been frozen, preserved through cryogenics for some future resurrection. He had left behind secret plans, coded instructions, messages to be delivered at appointed times. He had built something beneath the castle at Disneyland, a final resting place worthy of the mythology he had created. None of it was true. But the persistence of such stories spoke to something deeper, a collective unwillingness to accept that the man who had promised forever could be subject to the same mortality as everyone else. The house at 355 Carrollwood Drive held no such illusions. It knew what had happened within its walls during those final months. It had witnessed the slow diminishment, the carefully managed appearances, the growing distance between the public figure and the private man. It had seen Walter Elias Disney become, at last, simply Walt, a husband and father facing the end with whatever grace and fear such moments allow. To understand what was lost in that hospital room, one must return to what was built. The house at 355 Carrollwood Drive had not always existed in Walt Disney's life. For years, he and Lillian had lived more modestly, their circumstances rising and falling with the fortunes of a studio that seemed perpetually on the edge of either triumph or ruin. The early decades of their marriage had been marked by financial uncertainty, by projects that consumed everything and returned only promises, by the particular anxiety of a man who understood that his imagination was both his greatest asset and his most demanding creditor. The move to Holmby Hills came in 1950, when Walt was approaching 50 and the studio had finally achieved something resembling stability. Snow White had proven that animated features could succeed. Fantasia had proven they could fail. By the end of the 1940s, Walt Disney Productions was no longer a gamble. It was an institution. The name alone had become a guarantee, a promise of quality that translated into reliable returns. The property he selected reflected this new status. Holmby Hills sat adjacent to Bel Air and Beverly Hills, a neighborhood of old money and new fortunes, where privacy was the ultimate luxury. The lots were measured in acres rather than feet. The homes were set back from the road, invisible behind walls and hedges, and the carefully maintained illusion of pastoral isolation. It was, in many ways, the opposite of everything Walt had built his career upon. Disneyland would be designed for crowds, for movement, for the constant circulation of bodies and dollars. The Carrollwood House was designed for retreat. The residence itself was substantial, but not ostentatious by the standards of its neighbors. A single-story layout spread across the grounds, offering the kind of horizontal space that suggested permanence rather than ambition. There were 5 bedrooms, though the household would rarely fill them. There were gardens that required constant attention, lawns that demanded weekly manicuring, trees that had stood for decades before Walt's arrival. The previous owners had been wealthy in the anonymous way that characterized old Los Angeles money. Walt Disney would make the address famous, though he would have preferred otherwise. What distinguished the property was not its architecture, but its modifications. Within months of taking possession, Walt had begun transforming the backyard into something that existed nowhere else in Holmby Hills. The railroad came first. He had been fascinated by trains since childhood, since the years in Marceline, Missouri, when the sound of locomotives passing through town had represented escape, possibility, movement towards something larger than the circumscribed world his father had accepted. Now, with the resources to indulge any enthusiasm, he commissioned a fully operational miniature steam railroad, the Carrollwood Pacific, named for the street on which it ran. The construction required excavating a significant portion of the property. A tunnel was bored beneath Lillian's flower garden, a concession that required weeks of negotiation and demonstrated the limits of even Walt's domestic authority. The track circled the entire estate, passing through carefully landscaped terrain that suggested the American frontier in miniature. For a man who controlled thousands of employees and millions of dollars, this private railroad offered something increasingly rare, a domain where every decision was his alone. The workshop came later, a separate structure where Walt could retreat from the telephone calls and script conferences that defined his professional life. Here, he built models. He tinkered with machinery. He planned projects that might never see completion, freed from the pressure of release dates and shareholder expectations. Those who visited described it as cluttered but organized, filled with the tools of a man who understood how things worked at a mechanical level. Yet even in this sanctuary, work intruded. The boundaries between Walt Disney, the private citizen, and Walt Disney the brand had become impossible to maintain. Colleagues arrived for weekend meetings that extended into dinners. Journalists were granted carefully staged tours that presented the railroad as charming eccentricity rather than genuine obsession. The house became another set, another controlled environment, where the image could be managed and the narrative could be shaped. Lillian learned to accommodate the intrusions, to smile for cameras that appeared without warning, to play the role of supportive wife in a marriage that had long since settled into something more complicated than any press release would acknowledge. The daughters, Diane and Sharon, grew up in this strange hybrid space, where the most famous father in America was also simply Dad, where the backyard contained wonders no other child could claim, where the price of proximity to genius was the constant presence of people who wanted something from him. The 1950s transformed Walt Disney from a successful filmmaker into something closer to an American institution. The decade began with him as the head of an animation studio. It ended with him presiding over a diversified entertainment empire that included television, theme parks, merchandise licensing, and real estate development on a scale that would have seemed fantastical just 10 years earlier. The house on Carrollwood Drive witnessed this transformation from the inside, serving as both refuge from and staging ground for an expansion that seemed to have no natural limit. Disneyland opened in Anaheim on July 17, 1955, and nothing was ever quite the same. The park had been Walt's obsession for years, an idea that had germinated during visits to amusement parks with his daughters and grown into something far more ambitious than anyone at the studio had anticipated. He had mortgaged his life insurance to finance the early planning. He had fought with his brother Roy, the financial conservative who had kept the company solvent through decades of Walt's enthusiasms, over budgets that seemed to spiral without end. He had driven his designers to exhaustion and beyond, demanding perfection in details that most visitors would never consciously notice. The opening day was a disaster by most measurable standards. Asphalt had not fully cured in the July heat. Drinking fountains failed. Counterfeit tickets flooded the gates with twice the expected crowd. Yet none of it mattered. Within weeks, the initial chaos had been forgotten, replaced by lines that stretched for hours and revenues that exceeded every projection. Walt had bet everything on an idea that defied conventional wisdom, and he had won. At Carrollwood Drive, the victory registered in subtle ways. There were more visitors now, more meetings conducted in the living room and on the patio beside the railroad tracks. Television crews arrived to film segments that presented Walt as the avuncular host of a weekly program that brought his creations directly into American homes. The Disneyland television series, which had begun as a financing mechanism for the park, had become its own phenomenon, making Walt's face and voice as familiar as any politician or movie star. He was no longer merely a producer, he was a presence. But presence came with costs that were not immediately visible. The pace of work intensified, even as the rewards multiplied. Walt rose early and stayed late at the studio, returning to Carrollwood often after his family had eaten dinner without him. The weekend railroad excursions that had once provided genuine relaxation became increasingly rare, replaced by working sessions that merely changed location. Lillian noted the absences without commenting on them directly. She had long since accepted that her husband's primary relationship was with his work, that she and the children occupied a secondary position that no amount of success would change. The smoking continued, as it had for decades. Walt consumed cigarettes, with the mechanical regularity of someone who no longer noticed the habit, lighting each from the ember of the last, filling ashtrays that were emptied and filled again throughout every day. His cough had become a familiar sound at the studio, so constant that colleagues stopped registering it as anything unusual. When questioned about his health, he deflected with the practiced ease of a man who had spent his career controlling narratives. The body was merely a vehicle for the imagination. It would serve until it was no longer needed. The late 50s brought additional pressures that the public never saw. Television production demanded constant output. The park required continuous investment and expansion. New projects proliferated faster than the organization could absorb them. Walt pushed for a second park, larger and more ambitious, to be built somewhere in the eastern United States. He commissioned studies of sites in Florida, acquiring land through shell corporations to prevent the price speculation that had plagued the Anaheim development. He imagined not merely a park, but an entire city, a planned community that would demonstrate how Americans might live in the future. At home, the evidence of strain accumulated in small ways. Walt's temper, always volatile, became less predictable. He withdrew into silences that could last for days, present at the dinner table but unreachable, his mind clearly elsewhere. The railroad sat unused for weeks at a time. The workshop gathered dust. Lillian learned to read the signs, to gauge which version of her husband would walk through the door each evening, to adjust her expectations accordingly. The daughters had grown and departed, Diane marrying in 1954, Sharon following in 1959. The house that had once contained a family now held primarily memories and obligations. Walt and Lillian settled into the careful distance of a long marriage, sharing space without necessarily sharing lives, bound by history and habit and the impossibility of imagining any alternative. The public Walt Disney of the early 1960s bore little resemblance to the private man who returned each evening to Carrollwood Drive. On television, he remained the genial host, the trusted guide through worlds of fantasy and tomorrow, his voice carrying the warmth of a favorite uncle, explaining wonders to eager children. In photographs, he smiled with practiced ease, the mustache and the twinkle combining to project an image of benevolent creativity that had become inseparable from the brand itself. This was the Walt Disney that America knew, the one that shareholders trusted, the one that parents welcomed into their living rooms without hesitation. The other Walt Disney was harder to locate. He emerged in the silences between public appearances, in the long drives home from the studio when the performance could finally cease. This version was exhausted in ways that sleep could not address. He was irritable, demanding, capable of cutting remarks that left subordinates shaken for days. He was also, by most accounts, increasingly alone. The inner circle that had surrounded him for decades had thinned through death, retirement, and the inevitable estrangements that accompany power held too long. The young artists who had built the studio's reputation in the 30s and 40s were now middle-aged men with families and mortgages, and the quiet resentments of those who had watched someone else receive credit for collective achievements. At the studio, Walt's authority remained absolute, but his engagement had become sporadic. Entire productions moved forward without his direct involvement, guided by executives and directors who had learned to interpret his preferences without requiring his presence. When he did appear, his attention often seemed elsewhere, fixed on the Florida project that had consumed his imagination more completely than any animated feature ever had. He spoke of Epcot, his experimental prototype community of tomorrow, with the fervor of a man who had found his final purpose. This would not be merely a theme park. It would be a functioning city, a demonstration of what American ingenuity could accomplish when freed from the compromises of existing urban systems. The Florida land acquisitions had proceeded with the secrecy that Walt had learned to value above almost everything else. Tens of thousands of acres had been assembled through dummy corporations with names that revealed nothing. Local officials who might have demanded concessions remained ignorant of the buyer's identity until the purchases were complete. When the announcement finally came in November of 1965, the scale of the ambition shocked even those who thought they understood Walt Disney's capacity for thinking beyond conventional limits. He was proposing to build not just an attraction, but an entire world. Yet even as he outlined these plans to the press, his body was delivering messages he refused to acknowledge. The cough had worsened. His energy flagged in ways that afternoon naps could no longer remedy. He had lost weight without trying, his clothes hanging differently on a frame that had always been slim but was now approaching gaunt. Associates noticed but did not comment. One did not question Walt Disney about matters he had not chosen to discuss. At Carrollwood Drive, the evidence accumulated in medicine bottles and doctor's appointments that Lillian tracked with growing concern. Walt dismissed her worries with the same deflection he applied to everything that threatened to slow his momentum. There was too much to accomplish. The Florida project required his attention. The studio needed guidance. Mortality was an abstraction that applied to other people, not to men with empires still to build. The house itself seemed to register the change in atmosphere. The railroad sat idle for longer stretches now, the locomotive requiring maintenance that Walt no longer found time to perform. The workshop remained locked for weeks at a time. Dinners were quieter, the conversation limited to logistics and schedules rather than the enthusiasms that had once animated even the most routine evenings. Lillian watched her husband retreat into a private space she could not access, his thoughts fixed on futures that seemed increasingly disconnected from the present moment. Visitors to Carrollwood during this period reported a household that felt suspended between eras. The decorations reflected tastes formed decades earlier. The photographs on display showed children who had long since become mothers themselves. Walt moved through these rooms like a guest in his own home, present but not entirely there, his mind already racing toward the next meeting, the next decision, the next problem, requiring his unique combination of vision and stubbornness. The final year began without announcement or recognition. 1966 arrived, and Walt Disney continued the routines that had defined his existence for as long as anyone could remember. He rose early, he worked late, he smoked constantly, he planned for a future he would not live to see. The diagnosis came in early November of 1966, though the symptoms had been announcing themselves for months to anyone willing to pay attention. Walt had finally submitted to a thorough examination after a polo injury from decades past had flared into persistent neck pain. The X-rays revealed what the doctors had suspected, but hoped not to find. A tumor sat in his left lung, a shadow on the film that rewrote every plan and projection he had made for the years ahead. The surgery took place on November the 7th at St. Joseph Medical Center in Burbank, chosen for its proximity to the studio and its willingness to maintain the absolute discretion that Walt demanded. The left lung was removed entirely. The surgeons found what they had feared. The cancer had spread to the lymph nodes. The prognosis, delivered privately to Walt and Lillian, offered no comfort. Months remained, perhaps. A year seemed optimistic. The man who had built an empire on the promise of happy endings was facing a conclusion that admitted no revision. The decision to maintain secrecy was immediate and absolute. The public learned only that Walt Disney had undergone surgery for an old neck injury and was recovering well. No mention was made of cancer. No suggestion appeared in any press release that the situation was anything other than routine. The machinery of image management that had served the Disney brand for decades now turned to its most challenging assignment, concealing the mortality of a man whose very name had become synonymous with timelessness. At Carrollwood Drive, a different kind of concealment took hold. Walt returned from the hospital weakened, but determined to maintain the appearance of normalcy. He dressed each morning in the clothes he had always worn. He made phone calls to the studio. He reviewed plans for Florida with an intensity that suggested either denial or defiance, perhaps both. Lillian watched these performances with the complicated grief of someone mourning a loss that had not yet fully occurred. The household staff noticed the changes they were instructed not to discuss. The meals grew smaller, adjusted to an appetite that had diminished along with everything else. The schedule contracted, early bedtimes replacing the late nights that had once been routine. Visitors were carefully screened, their access limited to windows, when Walt felt strong enough to maintain the fiction of recovery. Those who did see him reported a man who seemed diminished but unbowed, still issuing directives, still demanding updates, still planning as if the future remained infinite. The railroad sat untouched now, a relic of enthusiasms that belonged to a healthier time. The track had begun to show signs of neglect, weeds pushing through the carefully maintained ballast, switches requiring adjustments that no one thought to make. The locomotive remained in its roundhouse, cold and still, waiting for an engineer who would never return to the controls. In the workshop, projects sat half-finished on benches, tools arranged with a precision that now seemed like an artifact from another era. Walt continued to travel to the studio when his strength permitted, though these visits grew shorter and less frequent as November turned toward December. He would sit in his office, surrounded by the storyboards and concept art that had always fueled his imagination, and stare at plans for attractions he would never see completed. The Pirates of the Caribbean was nearly finished. The Haunted Mansion remained in development. Florida existed only as models and blueprints, a dream that others would have to realize. The conversations during these final weeks were remembered differently by different witnesses. Some recalled a man at peace with his circumstances, focused on ensuring continuity for the organization he had built. Others described flashes of anger, of frustration at a body that had betrayed him, of bitterness toward a fate that seemed profoundly unjust. Both versions were likely true. Dying allows for contradiction in ways that living often does not. Lillian maintained her vigil with the composure that decades of marriage to a public figure had taught her. She fielded inquiries with practiced deflection. She managed the household with attention to details that provided distraction from larger realities. She sat with her husband in the evenings, in the living room they had shared for 16 years, and tried to find words for things that words could not adequately address. The silences between them had always been part of their marriage. Now those silences carried different weight. December arrived with the particular clarity that Los Angeles winter sometimes offers, the air scrubbed clean by winds from the desert, the light sharp and unforgiving. Walt returned to the hospital on December 15th, his condition having deteriorated beyond what home care could manage. The room that awaited him would be his last. The room on the top floor of St. Joseph Medical Center offered a view that Walt Disney likely never noticed. By the time he returned to the hospital in early December, his attention had turned inward, focused on the increasingly difficult work of breathing, of managing pain, of enduring the indignities that terminal illness imposes, regardless of wealth or fame. The machines surrounding his bed recorded the gradual failure of systems that had served him for 65 years. The doctors could offer comfort, but not hope. The ending, when it came, would come soon. Roy Disney visited daily, the older brother who had spent a lifetime cleaning up after Walt's enthusiasms, finding money for impossible projects, translating artistic vision into corporate reality. Their relationship had never been simple. They had fought over budgets and priorities and the fundamental direction of the company they had built together. But in that hospital room, such conflicts belonged to another time. Roy sat with his brother and talked about Florida, about the plans that would continue regardless of what happened in the days ahead. Whether Walt could fully comprehend these conversations in his final hours remains unclear. The morphine had begun to blur the boundaries between waking and sleep. Lillian came and went, her presence constant, but her composure increasingly difficult to maintain. She had known this man for more than 40 years, had watched him transform from a struggling animator into the most recognized creative figure in American life. She had accommodated his obsessions and tolerated his absences and built a marriage around the spaces he left available. Now she sat beside him as that marriage approached its conclusion, holding a hand that had drawn the first sketches of Mickey Mouse, that had signed contracts worth millions, that had waved to crowds who adored a version of her husband she sometimes barely recognized. The daughters arrived, Diane and Sharon, bringing with them the grandchildren Walt had delighted in spoiling. The family gathered in the way families do when the end is near, speaking in hushed tones in hallways, rotating through the room in shifts that allowed for both presence and privacy. The conversations were ordinary in the way that final conversations often are, touching on matters both trivial and profound, circling around the central fact that no one quite knew how to address directly. On the ceiling of his hospital room, Walt reportedly traced the layout of the Florida property during one of his final lucid periods, using the acoustic tiles as a grid to map attractions that existed only in his imagination. The story may be apocryphal, one of many legends that would accumulate around his death in the years that followed. But it captured something essential about the man. Even at the end, he was planning, building, refusing to accept limitations that others considered absolute. December 15th dawned gray over Burbank. At 9:35 in the morning, Walter Elias Disney's heart stopped. The cause of death was recorded as acute circulatory collapse, a clinical phrase that concealed the months of cancer that had preceded it. He was 65 years old. He had been married for 41 years. He left behind 2 daughters, 7 grandchildren, a brother who would now bear the burden of completing his final vision, and a company that had no clear plan for existence without him. The news reached the public within hours, though the full truth of his illness would not emerge for some time. The obituaries focused on achievement rather than suffering, on the legacy of joy rather than the reality of decline. Flags at Disneyland flew at half-staff. Tributes poured in from presidents and prime ministers, from fellow artists and ordinary citizens who felt they had lost someone they knew personally, though they had never met him. The machinery of mourning engaged with the same efficiency that had characterized every other Disney production. The funeral took place 2 days later at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, in a ceremony so private that its details remained obscure for years. Only immediate family attended. No public announcement was made until after the burial had concluded. The grave itself was unmarked initially, a final privacy for a man who had spent his life in the public eye. The secrecy fueled speculation that would persist for decades, rumors of cryogenic preservation and hidden tombs and elaborate deceptions that seemed more suited to fiction than fact. At Carrollwood Drive, the house absorbed the loss in silence. Lillian returned from the funeral to rooms that still held her husband's presence in countless small ways. The arrangement of objects on his desk, the clothes hanging in his closet, the faint smell of cigarette smoke that would take months to fully dissipate. The railroad sat in the backyard, waiting for a conductor who would never return. The workshop held tools that would never again be lifted by the hands that had placed them there. Lillian remained at Carrollwood Drive for nearly 3 decades after her husband's death, a presence so quiet that neighbors sometimes forgot she was there. The house continued much as it had been, preserved not as a museum, but as a home that simply stopped changing. The railroad received occasional maintenance, but rarely operated. The workshop remained locked, its contents undisturbed, tools arranged exactly as Walt had left them. The company Walt left behind continued without him. though not in the directions he had imagined. Roy completed the Florida project, insisting it be named Walt Disney World as a final tribute to the brother whose vision had made it possible. He survived the park's opening by only 2 months, dying in December of 1971. The empire passed to executives who had learned from the founders but could not replace them. Epcot eventually opened in 1982, though it bore little resemblance to the experimental city Walt had described in his final months. The functioning community, the revolutionary approach to urban living, these had proven too ambitious for an organization that had learned to value predictability over risk. What remained was a theme park, successful by most measures, but far from the utopian vision that had consumed Walt's imagination at the end. At Carrollwood Drive, time moved differently. Lillian entertained rarely and appeared in public even less frequently. The house aged around her, its mid-century design becoming first dated, then historic, then valuable in ways that had nothing to do with its original purpose. She died in 1997, at the age of 98, in the house she had shared with Walt for 16 years and inhabited alone for 30 more. The property passed to her daughters and eventually to new owners who understood its significance without having lived its history. The railroad was donated to the Los Angeles Live Steamers Railroad Museum, where it operates still, carrying passengers who may or may not know whose hands once guided it around a backyard in Holmby Hills. The house itself was demolished in 2001, replaced by a larger residence that erased most traces of what had stood before. The trees Walt had walked beneath, the grounds where his railroad had run, these exist now only in photographs and memories that fade with each passing year. What remains is the silence that gathers around lives too large to be fully remembered. The man himself recedes behind the mythology, becoming less a person than a collection of stories told to serve purposes he could not have anticipated. At 355 Carrollwood Drive, where a different house now stands, nothing marks what once existed there. The fog still rolls through Holmby Hills on certain winter evenings, curling past gates and hedges, passing without stopping, indifferent to what has been lost.